Ever notice how everyone around you seems to hold the exact same opinions? Even on things that should be objective, provable, and grounded in evidence. It can feel almost eerie, like disagreement just disappeared. That's not a coincidence. It's the result of a powerful digital phenomenon shaping what we see, what we trust, and what we accept as true. We're living in a moment where truth is increasingly defined less by verified information and more by a shared feeling, a collective vibe that tells us what sounds right and what feels wrong. This isn't science fiction, it's the echo chamber effect quietly taking hold across our online lives, reinforced by algorithms, social platforms, and media ecosystems that reward emotional alignment over factual accuracy. If you've ever felt stuck in a loop, seeing the same arguments repeated, the same narratives reinforced, and fewer genuinely opposing viewpoints breaking through, that's exactly what's happening. The pursuit of good vibes and emotional certainty is slowly replacing critical thinking, evidence, and verification. And the more comfortable it feels, the harder it becomes to recognize what's been lost. Today, we're breaking down how this shift happened, why it matters far more than most people realize, and how to recognize when shared feelings start replacing facts, before that substitution reshapes how we see reality itself. One of the strangest shifts many of us have noticed in recent years isn't what people believe, but how they come to believe it. There's a growing sense inside political and cultural spaces that if something feels true, if it matches the emotional temperature of the room, then it must be true. This is what I mean by the rise of vibe-based narratives, stories, claims, and conclusions that spread not because they've been verified, but because they resonate. You'll hear phrases like, everyone knows, it's obvious, just look around, or the energy doesn't lie. None of these are evidence. They are signals of group agreement. And once enough people repeat the same sentiment with confidence, it starts to feel like consensus has been reached, even when no real verification has taken place. This is where the illusion creeps in. In an echo chamber, agreement doesn't come from facts being tested and surviving scrutiny. It comes from emotional alignment. If a claim fits the mood, the frustration, the anger, or the suspicion of the audience, it spreads faster than something boring but true. Facts require patience. Vibes reward immediacy. What's especially concerning is that this doesn't always look like misinformation in the obvious sense. Sometimes it's half-truths stitched together with speculation. Sometimes it's genuine uncertainty presented with absolute confidence. Sometimes it's questions framed in a way that strongly implies an answer without ever proving it. And because it feels organic, like something we all arrived at together, it becomes harder to challenge without seeming disloyal. This is how emotional resonance replaces evidence as the primary truth filter. Instead of asking, is this accurate? The unspoken question becomes, does this feel right to people like us? If the answer is yes, the claim gains traction. If the answer is no, even well-documented facts can be dismissed as propaganda, corruption, or manipulation by outsiders. And this is why this issue goes far beyond normal differences of opinion. Healthy disagreements assumes a shared respect for reality, even when we argue about its meaning or implications. What we're seeing now is something more structural, a shift in how truth itself is evaluated. The system rewards emotional certainty over intellectual humility. It favors narratives that reinforce identity over those that demand critical thinking.
It's a gut thing, okay? I don't know, no, but I know. Okay? I don't know, no, but I know.
Once that shift takes hold, consensus becomes performative. People nod along not because they've checked the facts, but because dissent feels risky. Over time, the echo chamber grows louder, not smarter, and the more it amplifies itself, the harder it becomes to tell the difference between widespread agreement and collective self-deception. That's the illusion, and it's far more powerful than it looks at first glance. Once you start noticing vibe-based narratives, you can't unsee the machinery behind them. They don't usually arrive as fully formed lies. They arrive wrapped in emotionally suggestive language, repeated often enough that your brain fills in the blanks for you. That's the key move here, substitution. Evidence gets quietly replaced with feeling, and certainty is borrowed from tone rather than proof. Now, one of the most common techniques is vagueness paired with repetition. Instead of making a clear claim that can be tested, Some outlets lean heavily on phrases like something isn't adding up. People are asking questions. There is a lot we are not being told. Or connect the dots. None of these statements actually assert anything concrete, but say them often enough, with enough confidence, and they create a mood. Suspicion without accountability. Then there is the classic just asking questions posture. On the surface, it sounds reasonable, even humble. Curiosity is healthy after all. But this tactic often isn't about inquiry, it's about implication. Questions are framed in a way that nudges the audience toward a specific conclusion, while giving the speaker plausible deniability. If challenged, they can retreat to, I never said that. I was just raising concerns. Emotionally, though, the seed has already been planted. Loaded language does a lot of the heavy lifting here too. Words like they, the regime, globalist, handlers, dark forces, or the real story are intentionally imprecise but emotionally powerful. They signal danger without defining it. The brain responds to threat language much faster than it responds to nuance. So once those terms enter the conversation, rational evaluation tends to take a backseat. Anecdotes, distrust narratives, and suggestive framing that leaned heavily on fear and betrayal. Scientific rebuttals struggled to compete, not necessarily because they were wrong, but because they were emotionally flat compared to the outrage-driven framing. Even when courts, audits, and bipartisan officials fail to substantiate certain allegations, emotionally compelling narratives continue to circulate. Why? Because they align with existing frustration and distrust. Once a claim fits the emotional worldview, the burden of proof quietly disappears. The feeling becomes the evidence. Foreign policy insinuations follow a similar pattern. Vague accusations about shadow alliances, secret betrayals, or hidden motivations often gain momentum not because of verified intelligence, but because they match a pre-existing sense that we're being played. Again, emotional coherence replaces factual confirmation. Now, social media supercharges all of this. Algorithms are not designed to reward accuracy, they are designed to reward engagement. Content that triggers anger, fear, or moral outrage keeps people scrolling, commenting, and sharing. So emotionally charged, unverified narratives naturally rise to the top, especially within ideologically aligned communities. The more a user interacts with that kind of content, the more of it they're shown. Before long, the echo chamber doesn't just reinforce beliefs, it intensifies them. And because these platforms blur the line between commentary and reporting, the audience often doesn't slow down enough to distinguish opinion from fact. A confident voice plus emotional alignment starts to feel like authority. The repetition creates familiarity, and familiarity creates trust. This is how emotional substitution works. Not through one big deception, but through thousands of small cues that gently train the audience to prioritize how something feels over whether it's true.
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. But I'm putting it out there. And we'll find out if I'm right by how much they freak out and pay people to make videos going, oh, it's so crazy that Candace is suggesting. When they start paying for that campaign, that propaganda campaign, we can then go ahead and take what I say to the bank.
And once that habit forms, facts don't just lose influence. They start to feel suspicious. That's the real danger here, not disagreement, not skepticism, but a system where emotion becomes the default lens for reality itself. Here is where things stop being abstract and start getting genuinely dangerous. When vibes replace verified information, accountability doesn't just weaken, it quietly evaporates. And once that happens, nobody at the top really has to answer for anything anymore. Not politicians, not pundits, not influencers, not even movements that once prided themselves on truth, discipline, and intellectual rigor. In a vibe-based ecosystem, being factually wrong no longer carries a cost. What matters is whether you felt right, whether you captured the mood of the audience, whether you validated their frustration or suspicion.
I was having the conversations with people that were going out and committing crimes. And so I understood what was kind of pushing them there. And so I do want people to know that just because someone has committed a crime, it doesn't make them a criminal. That is completely different. Being a criminal is more so about your mindset.
If the narrative resonates emotionally, corrections don't land as clarifications. They land as attacks, and instead of adjusting, the speaker often doubles down, reframing criticism as proof that they must be over the target. That's a massive shift from how accountability used to work. Traditionally, politics emphasized data, outcomes, and consequences. If a claim was made, it could be interrogated. If a policy failed, it had to be defended or abandoned. But in a vibe-first environment, politicians and commentators can float insinuations indefinitely without ever cashing them out into verifiable claims. They never have to prove anything, only sustain the feeling that something is wrong. We've seen this play out clearly in public discourse around major policy issues. Take debates over public health, election administration, or national security. Instead of arguments anchored in evidence, numbers, timeliness, legal frameworks, conversations often drift into suggestion-heavy territory. Phrases like, you know what's really going on, or ask yourself why they don't want you talking about this, replace actual substantiation. The result is policy driven not by facts on the ground, but by emotional momentum. This is how you end up with serious legislative proposals, funding decisions, or public trust being shaped by narratives that were never fully examined in the first place. When leaders respond to outrage rather than information, they aren't governing, they are reacting. And reaction-based governance is volatile by nature. It swings wildly, overcorrects, and often causes the very instability it claims to be fighting. Public discourse suffers too. Once insinuation becomes the dominant mode of communication, good faith debate collapses. You can't argue against a feeling. You can't falsify a vibe. And that means anyone who asks for evidence gets reframed as naive, compromised, or disloyal. The incentive structure flips. Skepticism is no longer aimed upward at power, but sideways at anyone who refuses to go along. That sets an incredibly dangerous precedent. When emotional conviction consistently outranks empirical evidence, truth becomes negotiable. Reality turns into a team sport, and once that happens, bad actors don't even need to lie. They just need to signal the right emotions. The loudest voice wins, not the most accurate one. Over time, this corrodes trust across the board. Institutions lose credibility, not necessarily because they are always wrong, but because people stop caring whether they are right or wrong at all. Everything becomes suspect except whatever reinforces the group's emotional posture in that moment. And here is the uncomfortable part. This doesn't make a movement stronger, it makes it brittle. A movement built on vibes can't self-correct. It can't admit error without feeling like betrayal. It can't refine its arguments without someone accusing it of going soft. Eventually, it starts eating its own credibility because there is no internal mechanism left to separate truth from theatrics. Accountability is what keeps power honest. When it disappears, you don't get freedom. You get chaos dressed up as conviction. That's the real cost of abandoning facts for feelings. And once that line is crossed, getting back to a reality-based conversation becomes much harder than people realize. By the time vibes replace verified information, the echo chamber isn't an accident anymore. It's an architecture. Carefully reinforced, constantly fed, and incredibly hard to escape once you are inside it. Most people don't wake up one day and decide, I only want information that agrees with me. It happens gradually through habit. You click what feels familiar, you stay where you feel understood. You return to voices that speak your emotional language.
So I had to go around the country and educate people about what immigrants do for this country, or the fact that we are a country of immigrants.
Right.
The fact is, ain't none of y'all trying to go and farm right now. Okay, so I'm lying. Raise your hands. You're not. We done picking cotton. We are. You can't pay us enough to find a plantation.
I know that's right.
Over time, your media diet narrows. Not because you're closed-minded, but because friction feels exhausting. This is true on both sides of the political spectrum. Content isn't just aligned ideologically, it's aligned affectively. Outrage sounds like outrage everywhere you go. Suspicion sounds the same. Validation repeats itself in slightly different accents. The repetition creates the illusion of consensus. When every video, podcast, clip, and post echoes the same emotional framing, it begins to feel like everyone sees what you see. Not because it's universally true, but because the scent has quietly been filtered out of your environment. Alternative interpretations don't feel merely wrong. They feel alien, even threatening. Partisan media figures and influencers play a central role here. Whether intentionally or not, many of them have learned that emotional certainty outperforms cautious accuracy. Strong vibes travel better than nuanced facts. And once an audience responds to that, there is enormous pressure to keep feeding the same tone, the same suspicions, the same unresolved questions. This is how vibe-based discourse becomes legitimized. When a trusted figure repeats a claim, or even just gestures toward it repeatedly without proof, it gains weight simply through familiarity. Over time, the lack of evidence stops mattering. The repetition itself becomes the evidence. Viewers begin to say things like, "Everyone's talking about it," when in reality they are hearing the same idea recycled within a closed loop. And because these figures are often rewarded with views, donations, and social clout, there is little incentive to disrupt the vibe. Correcting the record risks alienating an audience that didn't come for clarity, but for emotional reinforcement. Layer on top of this the psychological biases we all carry, and the echo chamber becomes more powerful. Confirmation bias ensures that we instinctively gravitate toward information that supports what we already believe and dismiss what challenges it.
Yeah, there is simple arguments like, who pays for the recession? Is it the wealthy or is it the overwhelming majority? We need to be making that argument. We need to be making the argument that caring work, as we've seen in this pandemic, is the absolute bedrock of our society and needs to be properly valued and properly funded, and we need to orientate our whole system of value in that direction. We need a Green New Deal, and not just a Green New Deal that is a bit of investment in wind farms like Boris Johnson, but one that has got some class bite, one that says, and who is going to pay for this massive social transformation is the big businesses and the super rich who have had their asset prices inflated dramatically since the financial crisis. The big companies that have paid for climate change denial, they are going to pay for this, and this is going to be an environmental, a democratic and a social transformation. I think we've got the antagonism over housing. Homes are homes to live in. They're not for landlords and banks to take away from us. And I think that the final argument that we all need to be making is that migrants and minorities are not to blame for the crisis at all and are an absolutely vital part of any rebuilding. So I think that's the second thing.
Groupthink makes us hesitant to voice doubt once the narrative feels socially cemented. Nobody wants to be the one asking uncomfortable questions when everyone else seems confident. Now, introduce algorithmic recommendations into the mix. Social media platforms don't optimize for truth, they optimize for engagement. And nothing engages quite like emotionally charged content that confirms existing beliefs. So the algorithm learns your preferences quickly. Watch one video framed around suspicion or outrage, and suddenly your feed is full of them. Each one feels like independent validation when it's actually a curated stream reinforcing a single emotional lane. And that's how the echo chamber seals itself. At that point, the vibes don't just reflect belief, they shape it. Emotional reactions get faster. Skepticism becomes selective, and opposing information doesn't feel like something to evaluate. It feels like something to resist. The most troubling part is that none of this requires malicious intent. It's the natural outcome of incentives, psychology, and technology aligning in the same direction. But the effect is still corrosive. The more self-reinforcing the chamber becomes, the harder it is for truth to penetrate, even when the truth would ultimately strengthen the movement rather than weaken it. An echo chamber doesn't just amplify misinformation, it slowly retrains people on how to think, not just what to think. And once that happens, breaking the cycle requires more than fact checks. It requires rebuilding trust in the idea that disagreement, evidence, and correction are not threats, they are safeguards. That's the architecture we are living inside now. And understanding it is the first step toward dismantling it. If the problem was simply bad actors, the solution would be easy. You'd just avoid them. But what makes the echo chamber effect so dangerous is that it doesn't rely on villains. It relies on habits, incentives, comfort, and the very human desire to feel certain in an uncertain world. So, reclaiming truth and integrity doesn't start with purges or call-out campaigns. It starts with personal discipline. The practical step is learning to recognize vibe-based narratives when they appear. A good rule of thumb is this: if a claim makes you feel strongly before you understand it, pause. Emotional reactions aren't proof of manipulation, but they are signals. Ask yourself a few basic questions. What exactly is being claimed? What evidence is being offered, not implied? Is this information new, or is it being recycled with heightened urgency? And crucially, will this claim still hold weight if the tone were neutral instead of charged? Another important habit is separating questions from insinuations. There is nothing wrong with asking questions. Healthy skepticism is essential. But when questions are asked repeatedly without any attempt to seek or present answers, they stop being inquiries and start functioning as accusations. If a commentator keeps just asking questions, but never follows up with verified facts, sources, or corrections, that's a red flag. Resisting vibe-based narratives also means widening your information diet. Even when it's uncomfortable, this doesn't mean consuming media you hate or abandoning your principles. It means intentionally exposing yourself to reporting that prioritizes evidence over emotional payoff. Read primary sources when possible. Compare coverage across outlets. Notice where facts are consistent and where interpretations diverge. Over time, this builds an internal compass that doesn't rely on vibes to determine truth. This is where media literacy becomes non-negotiable. We are no longer living in a media environment where misinformation is rare or obvious. We are living in a post-factual landscape where truth is often submerged beneath tone, timing, and tribal loyalty. Media literacy isn't about memorizing what outlets are good or bad. It's about understanding how narratives are constructed, how incentives shape coverage, and how your own biases influence what feels credible. Critical thinking in this sense isn't cynicism. It's discernment. It's the ability to hold two ideas at once. That institutions can fail and that evidence still matters. That elites can lie and that not every uncomfortable fact is propaganda. That emotional resonance can feel true without actually being true. Most importantly, reclaiming integrity requires moral courage from audiences, not just journalists. If we reward outrage more than accuracy, we shouldn't be surprised when outrage dominates. If we excuse insinuation because it aligns with our side, we normalize a standard that will eventually be used against us. Truth cannot survive if it only matters when it's convenient. That's why supporting journalism committed to verifiable facts is not optional anymore. It doesn't mean blind trust. It means valuing transparency, corrections, sourcing, and accountability over ideological comfort. It means sharing information responsibly, resisting the urge to amplify claims you haven't vetted just because they feel right. And it means challenging normalization when you see it, even gently, asking for sources, encouraging clarification, saying, let's slow down and verify this, instead of piling on emotionally. Those small hacks matter more than viral takedowns ever will, because at the end of the day, the health of any movement depends on its relationship with reality. A cause untethered from facts doesn't become stronger, it becomes brittle. Loud but hollow, confident but fragile. Reclaiming truth isn't about winning arguments online. It's about preserving the conditions that make self-government, moral persuasion, and honest debate possible at all. And that responsibility does not belong to algorithms, platforms, or pundits alone. It belongs to us, all of us.